Let's begin with a scene that feels small, until you realize it's the opening shot of a global war. Imagine it's a Tuesday evening. You walk into your local grocery store. Nothing dramatic. You're not stocking up for a hurricane. You're just buying basics. Bread, pasta, rice, the quiet staples of a functioning civilization. But the shelves aren't just expensive. They're bare. Not a few items missing. Not temporary shortages. Bare in the way that makes the air feel different. Like the room has lost oxygen. You ask a manager what's going on. You expect the usual excuses. Inflation, trucks delayed, supply chain drama, another headline you'll forget tomorrow. But they don't say that. They look tired. And they say something far worse. We ran out of the chemicals to grow the plants. That sentence should terrify you. Because it reveals a hidden truth about modern life, one we don't like to admit. Here's the fact that should keep you awake at night, roughly. 50% of the nitrogen atoms in your body, right now half the atoms that help build your muscle, your skin, your DNA did not come from nature. They came from a factory. Half of you is industrial, not metaphorically. Chemically, we have spent the last century hacking the planet so it can feed 8 billion people. We didn't simply improve farming, we rewired biology. We learned how to turn fossil fuels into food, how to convert natural gas into bread and oil into calories. The result is the greatest population boom in human history. But it also created a dependency so deep, so total, that it functions like a life support machine for civilization. And that machine is starting to sputter. Because the input's fertilizer energy, minerals are increasingly controlled by geopolitics, by sanctions, by cartels, by unstable supply chains, and by a handful of nations that don't always like each other or share the same rules. We're entering a new era of warfare. Not the kind with bombs falling from the sky, though that's still here. This is the kind where the weapon isn't a missile. It's a bag of white powder. Welcome to the Fertilizer War. Worthy conflict underneath the conflict. The silent contest for the chemicals that decide who eats and who doesn't. And before we go any further, we need to understand the addiction most people don't even know they have. Because fertilizer isn't an optional tool of modern agriculture. It is the invisible foundation of modern civilization. The paradox is almost cosmic. The Earth's atmosphere is about 78% nitrogen. We are swimming in nitrogen, drowning in it. And yet plants can't use it. Nitrogen in the air is bonded so tightly that crops can't drink it in. It's like being surrounded by water in the middle of an ocean and dying of thirst. For most of human history, that limitation imposed a ceiling on population. You could only grow so much food because nature could only fix so much nitrogen through slow processes: lightning, manure, compost, rotating legumes. This is why Malthus was statistically right for centuries. Populations kept pushing against food limits. Then, in the early 20th century, two German chemists changed everything. Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch. Together, they created the Haber-Bosch process, the invention that arguably matters. More than the internet, more than the smartphone, more than electricity grids, in terms of raw human survival. The mechanics are brutally simple, almost violent. Take nitrogen from the air, mix it with hydrogen, compress it under enormous pressure around 200 atmospheres. Heat it to hundreds of degrees. Use catalysts to force chemistry to do what nature can't do fast enough. And you get ammonia. Synthetic fertilizer, bred from thin air. This single process made it possible for the planet to support billions of extra people. Without it, many scientists argue Earth's sustainable human population would be closer to 4 billion. We don't have 4 billion. We have 8. Do the math. That means around 4 billion of us are alive because of an industrial chemical process. We are not living on a natural planet anymore. We are living on an engineered one. But here is where the story turns dark and where the 21st century becomes terrifying. Because fertilizer isn't just chemistry, it's energy. Where does the hydrogen come from? Not from the sky, not from some renewable miracle. For most fertilizer production today, the hydrogen is stripped from hydrocarbons, especially natural gas, methane. And that means modern agriculture is not simply growing food. It is using land to convert fossil fuels into calories. When natural gas prices spike, fertilizer becomes expensive. When fertilizer becomes expensive, farmers apply less. When farmers apply less, yields drop. When yields drop, food prices rise. In wealthy countries, this looks like annoyance. In poorer countries, this looks like hunger. It's a direct transmission mechanism from the energy market to the hunger market. That's why 2022 mattered. When gas prices surged after the invasion of Ukraine, fertilizer prices didn't just rise, they exploded. And as fertilizer became unaffordable, production cuts began, planting decisions changed, and the global food system quietly moved closer to the edge. Now, some people respond to this with a morally appealing idea. Fine, we should just go organic. No synthetic fertilizer. Let's farm like our ancestors. That argument isn't wrong about the damage synthetic fertilizer can harm soil health, create algae blooms, and emit nitrous oxide, a greenhouse gas far more potent than CO. But here's the problem. You cannot fight physics with ideology. If you unplug the life support machine overnight, the patient doesn't heal. The patient collapses. In 2021, Sri Lanka tried this experiment in real time. The government banned synthetic fertilizers and pesticides overnight, promising a rapid shift to 100% organic farming. It sounded beautiful on paper. In reality, it was an economic suicide note. Yields collapsed. Rice production dropped. Tea exports, one of the country's financial lifelines, fell sharply. Food prices surged. Currency stability broke. And eventually, the public did what hungry people always do when their leaders gamble with physics. They revolted. They stormed the presidential palace. They swam in his pool. And they forced him to flee. That wasn't ancient history. That was yesterday. The lesson is not organic is bad. The lesson is that we are addicted to synthetic nitrogen, and you can't quit addiction by declaring it over. You need a transition, a controlled weaning. But right now, as we speak, the world is moving in the opposite direction, toward scarcity, toward weaponization, toward a future where the basic chemical inputs for food are controlled like oil by cartels, by sanctions, by export bans, by geopolitical leverage. And nitrogen is only the first pillar, because once you understand the N in NPK, you have to meet the next one, the K, potash. And unlike nitrogen, potash can't be pulled out of the air. It has to be mined. Which means the map of who controls it looks like a cartel diagram. If nitrogen is the heartbeat of modern agriculture, potash is the nervous system. It's the K-N-P potassium, not optional, not cosmetic. Potassium regulates how plants manage water, activate enzymes, and resist stress. Without it, crops become weak, thirsty, and fragile like an athlete trying to run on empty lungs. But unlike nitrogen, potash is not something you can manufacture out of thin air. You have to dig it up. Potash is ancient ocean residue salty mineral deposits left behind when seas evaporated millions of years ago. It's pink dust, crystalline rock, and the kind of commodity that seems boring. Until you realize it's a choke point for civilization. If you thought OPEC had a grip on oil, the potash map looks even more concentrated. A huge chunk of the world's traded potash has been dominated by Russia and Belarus, with Canada's especially Saskatchewan holding the other critical piece. Three main players. One fragile global pipeline. For years, this market was quiet. Predictable, the kind of commodity business that ran in the background of history trains moving pink dust. Contracts rolling over, farmers buying without thinking. Then February 24, 2022 happened. Russia invaded Ukraine, and the world split into sanctions and counter-sanctions. The West tried to carve out exemptions for food and fertilizer, because even hardened policymakers understand that starving the global South is not just immoral, it's destabilizing. But the carve-outs didn't matter as much as the fear. Banks didn't want to process payments for Russian-linked fertilizer firms. Insurance companies didn't want to cover ships. Logistics companies didn't want to touch cargo that might attract legal trouble. Even when trade is technically allowed, commerce can still die from chilling effects. And suddenly, the global supply of vitamin K for plants started choking. The consequence wasn't immediate famine, it was something worse, uncertainty. Because food systems don't collapse like movies with one dramatic explosion. They weaken quietly, like a body losing blood, drop by drop. Farmers plan seasons months in advance. They sign contracts, they hedge risk. But if they can't secure fertilizer inputs, they reduce application rates soar. They plant less acreage. Less fertilizer doesn't mean a slightly smaller harvest. It can mean a tipping point where yields fall hard enough to break profit margins, break supply, and break political stability. Now look at Brazil. Brazil is an agricultural superpower. It feeds a massive portion of the world through soybeans and corn. But Brazil has an Achilles heel. It imports most of its fertilizer inputs. It's potash poor by geology. They don't have the mineral jackpot sitting under their feet, so they rely on global supply chains for the substance that makes their fields productive. When the war began, Brazil panicked. And here's the moment that reveals how food really works in geopolitics. Brazil's then president flew to Moscow and met Putin just days before the invasion. Officially, it was diplomacy. Unofficially, it was survival math. He wasn't there for a handshake. He was there to beg for potash. And that's when the illusion dies. Because food sovereignty, the idea that a country with land and farmers is independent, is a myth if you don't control the inputs. If you need a hostile nation for the chemicals that make plants grow, you are not independent. You are a client state. This is the new currency of power. Not oil alone, but fertilizer. And if potash is a cartel, phosphate is a kingdom. Now we move to the P in NPK. Phosphorus isn't just a nutrient. 'Tis a molecular requirement for life. Phosphorus is in DNA, RNA, ATP, the energy currency of every living cell. Without it, there is no growth, no reproduction, no biology. And unlike nitrogen, which is renewable because it's in the air, phosphorus is finite. You cannot synthesize it. You mine it. Which is why geologists talk about peak phosphorus, the moment when high-quality, easily accessible reserves begin to decline, pushing extraction costs higher and making the world more vulnerable to price shocks. But scarcity isn't even the biggest geopolitical problem. The location is, because the phosphate map is absurd. According to major geological assessments, Morocco and the disputed territory of Western Sahara hold an overwhelming share of the world's known phosphate. Reserves often cited around 70% or more. Let that sink in. Saudi Arabia might hold a large share of global oil reserves on the order of tens of percent. Morocco holds the phosphorus keys to the global food system. This makes Morocco quietly one of the most strategically important nations on Earth for the 21st century. And the gatekeeper is the state-owned OCP group, massive, sophisticated, and fully aware of its leverage. This creates a geopolitical flashpoint most people never associate with food. Western Sahara, a desert territory Morocco claims, but which the Polisario Front, historically backed by Algeria, has fought over 4 decades. A frozen conflict, a slow burn, not usually on the front page, but hidden inside it is fertilizer. There's a phosphate mine in Western Sahara with infrastructure so enormous that a conveyor belt carrying rock to the coast stretches for tens of miles visible from space. If that region destabilizes, or if Morocco decides to weaponize export quotas the way OPEC weaponizes oil, the global food system doesn't get stressed, it gets cardiac arrest. This is the black swan nobody discusses at dinner. We worry about microchips in Taiwan. We worry about oil in the Strait of Hormuz. But the supply of phosphorus moving out of North Africa might matter more than both, because you can't eat semiconductors. And you can't eat geopolitics. Now add a second pressure point. China. China has periodically restricted phosphate exports to protect domestic farmers and stabilize internal prices, because in authoritarian states, hunger is not an economic issue. It's a political threat. When major exporters hoard, the world becomes more dependent on the remaining suppliers. Which means the 21st century could quietly evolve into a world where Morocco becomes the central banker of food security. If you want stable harvests, you'll need good terms with Rabi. And this is where the story transitions into the next phase. For decades, we lived inside just-in-time globalization, efficient supply chains, lean inventories, cheap inputs flowing smoothly across oceans. That era is ending. A new era is replacing it. Fertilizer nationalism. Every nation for itself. And once governments begin hoarding fertilizer like wartime ammunition, the entire global food system becomes a battlefield of export bans, subsidies, and strategic stockpiles. Because in the hierarchy of political fear, there is one terror above all others: hungry citizens. Before the tanks rolled into Ukraine, before the headlines screamed about war, something quieter happened. In October 2021, Beijing made a decision that barely registered in Western media, but it sent shockwaves through global agriculture. China, the world's largest producer of phosphate and urea, imposed strict export controls on fertilizers. Not because of a war, not because of sanctions, because domestic prices were rising. And if you are the Chinese Communist Party, there is one thing you fear more than foreign pressure: hungry citizens. High fertilizer prices mean higher food prices. Higher food prices mean unrest. And unrest is existential for a regime built on stability. So China did what any rational power does in a survival hierarchy. It shut the door. Millions of tons of fertilizer disappeared from the global market overnight. The message was simple: we feed our own soil first. This is fertilizer nationalism. And once one country does it, others follow. Because agriculture is not like consumer electronics. If the price of smartphones doubles, you upgrade less often. If fertilizer prices double, farmers cannot simply opt out. Fertilizer demand is price inelastic. Crops either get nutrients or yields collapse, which means farmers pay. And then consumers pay, or governments absorb the cost. India is the perfect example. India is one of the largest importers of urea. Its agricultural sector employs a massive share of the population. When global fertilizer prices spiked, the Indian government faced a brutal choice: pass the cost to farmers and risk riots, or subsidize fertilizer and swallow the fiscal burden. They chose to swallow it. In 2022, India's fertilizer subsidy bill ballooned to tens of billions of dollars. Not for luxury, not for defense, for nitrogen. That's the new reality. Governments are now spending GDP-sized sums to keep the price of dirt stable. This is no longer a global free market optimizing for efficiency. This is a fragmented world optimizing for survival. And when survival enters the equation, alliances weaken. Globalization works beautifully for iPhones. It breaks under pressure when it comes to food. Because when the choice is between your voters and someone else's hunger, leaders will choose their voters every time. And that's when we meet the invisible giants. Because nations don't actually mine and process fertilizer, corporations do. And the fertilizer industry is not a crowded marketplace of small competitors. It's an oligopoly. A handful of giants dominate global production and trade. Companies like Nutrien in Canada, Mosaic in the United States, Yara in Norway. CF Industries. Massive entities controlling key mines, plants, and logistics networks. In 2022, as farmers struggled and food prices soared, the profits of major fertilizer firms didn't merely rise. They exploded. Record earnings. Windfall margins. From a cold economic perspective, they didn't cause the crisis. They responded to it. Commodity markets price scarcity. But there is a dark irony in this system. When disaster strikes, the companies selling the only life raft often thrive. Fertilizer demand is non-negotiable. Farmers cannot skip a season. So when supply tightens and prices surge, the cost flows through the chain up to consumers and into corporate earnings. And because the industry is consolidated, disruptions ripple fast. A hurricane hits a mine in Florida. A strike halts production in Canada. A plant in Europe shuts down due to energy costs. Prices move globally. This is efficiency at scale, and brittleness at scale. We built a food system dependent on a handful of mines, a handful of processing plants, and a handful of firms. Efficient, profitable, fragile. Now, let's talk about Europe. Europe prides itself on climate leadership, green transition, decarbonization, sanctions on Russian fossil fuels. But here's the paradox that few politicians want to explain. In 2022, when natural gas prices in Europe soared 10 times higher than normal fertilizer, production became economically impossible. Ammonia plants shut down. At one point, a majority of Europe's ammonia capacity was offline because the math broke. If the gas costs more than the fertilizer sells for, you stop producing. So what did European farmers do? Did they suddenly switch to compost and organic rotation? No. They imported fertilizer from elsewhere, including Russia. Here's the irony that should make your head spin. Europe sanctioned Russian natural gas, the input, but continued purchasing Russian fertilizer, the output. In some sectors, Russian fertilizer exports to Europe actually increased in value. Europe outsourced the pollution, the energy intensity, and the industrial emissions, then bought back the finished product. This is the green paradox. You can reduce domestic emissions by pushing heavy industry abroad. But if you still consume the product, you haven't eliminated dependency. You've relocated it. The industrialization does not equal independence. It equals reliance on whoever still produces the goods. And if that producer is a geopolitical rival, you have traded moral signaling for strategic vulnerability. The uncomfortable truth is that climate policy and food security are now entangled in a way policymakers didn't fully anticipate. If Europe cannot produce its own fertilizer because energy is too expensive, it must import it. And imports are leverage. Which brings us back to the soil itself. Because even if geopolitics stabilized tomorrow, even if fertilizer flowed freely, there is a deeper crisis beneath our feet. We are not just running out of fertilizer. We are running out of soil. Industrial agriculture has treated soil as an inert medium, a sponge, to hold plants upright while we inject N, P, and K. But soil is alive. It is a biological ecosystem of microbes, fungi, carbon networks, and microscopic exchanges between roots and bacteria. Every harvest extracts nutrients. Every monoculture cycle strips diversity. If we replace only nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, we neglect the broader ecosystem of micronutrients and organic matter. Over time, soil structure collapses. It loses water retention. Rain washes nutrients into rivers, creating dead zones in oceans. Drought turns fields into dust. The UN's Food and Agriculture Organization has issued warnings that sound almost apocalyptic. If degradation continues at current rates, we could lose the majority of productive topsoil within decades. That doesn't mean farming ends instantly. It means yields decline, costs rise, vulnerability increases. And here lies the cruel paradox. The chemical model of agriculture saves billions today, but it also accelerates long-term degradation. Switching to regenerative methods rebuilds soil but often lowers yields in the short term. Lower yields mean higher prices. Higher prices mean instability. We are trapped in a Kobayashi-Maru scenario. The solution for tomorrow reduces supply today. And no politician wins elections by promising temporary hunger for future sustainability. So the chemical system persists. But chemical systems depend on geopolitics. And geopolitics now treats fertilizer like oil, which means food itself is becoming leverage. And when food becomes leverage, you enter a new Cold War. Not over missiles, over calories. For 30 years, the world operated under a quiet promise. If you had money, you could buy food. It didn't matter where you lived. Toronto, Tokyo, Tunis. Wheat from Ukraine. Rice from India. Palm oil from Indonesia. Soybeans from Brazil. Borders were open. Trade was efficient. The World Trade Organization was supposed to keep the pipes flowing. Globalization worked beautifully for calories. And then it didn't. In 2023, something snapped. India, the world's largest exporter of rice, responsible for roughly 40% of global rice. Trade looked at erratic monsoon rains and rising domestic prices and made a decision. They banned exports of non-basmati white rice. Overnight, ships were halted, contracts frozen, buyers scrambling. The global rice market spiked to levels not seen in over a decade. Now, if you live in a wealthy suburb in the United States or Europe, this might mean paying a few extra dollars for a bag of rice. But if you live in Nigeria, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, countries heavily dependent on imported rice, the impact is existential. India wasn't acting maliciously, was acting rationally. Facing elections, facing rising domestic prices, leaders chose their voters. And here is the brutal truth of food geopolitics. When forced to choose between starving your own citizens or exporting stability abroad, governments choose their own citizens every single time. Indonesia did it in 2022. Palm oil used in everything from cooking oil to cosmetics spiked in price. Indonesia banned exports to stabilize domestic markets. Ships were turned back from ports. Global vegetable oil markets, already stressed by the war in Ukraine, lurched into chaos. This is the beggar thy neighbor policy reborn. One country hoards to stabilize. Global prices rise. Another country hoards in response. Prices rise further. Feedback loop. We are dismantling the global food security architecture brick by brick. The WTO can issue statements. It cannot force a sovereign nation to export food against its will. We are entering what economists call deglobalization. In the food world, it feels more like the Hunger Games, and this is where the fertilizer war merges with geopolitics. Because food is no longer just sustenance, it is leverage. Look at the Black Sea Grain Initiative. When Russia blockaded Ukrainian ports in 2022, tens of millions of tons of grain were trapped. Wheat prices surged. Countries like Egypt, Bangladesh, and Turkey watched nervously. The United Nations and Turkey brokered a deal to allow shipments through. On the surface, it looked like humanitarian diplomacy. But under the surface, it was transactional. Russia used grain exports as bargaining chips, pressuring for sanctions relief on its own agricultural banking channels. When concessions weren't fully granted, Moscow withdrew from the deal. This wasn't about kindness. It was about power. In the modern era, a silo of wheat can be as strategically valuable as a silo of missiles. You cannot eat missiles, but you can buy votes at the United Nations with grain. At summits, Russia offered discounted or free grain shipments to select African nations. Why? Because in international forums, hunger shapes alignment. When bread prices rise, ideological purity fades. China plays its own version of this game. Ports, infrastructure, fertilizer investments, strategic supply chains. Morocco holds phosphate. Russia holds potash and nitrogen exports. China controls fertilizer production scale. Canada anchors potash reserves. Brazil and the United States hold vast farmland. Food is no longer charity. It is diplomacy. It is alliance building. It is coercion. And if the West wants to maintain influence in the 21st century, it cannot rely on rhetoric alone. It has to offer lunch. Because hungry nations do not vote for ideals. They vote for calories. But this raises a deeper, more uncomfortable question. Can we innovate our way out of this? History suggests we might. When Malthus predicted starvation in the 18th century, we invented the plow. When populations surged in the 20th century, we invented synthetic fertilizer and the Green Revolution. Humanity has repeatedly faced ceilings and broken through them. So what's next? Precision agriculture is one hope. Instead of spraying entire fields with fertilizer, farmers use drones and AI-driven machinery to apply nutrients plant by plant. Computer vision identifies weeds versus crops in milliseconds. This could cut fertilizer and pesticide use dramatically, perhaps by half or more. Then there is green ammonia. Today, ammonia production is tied to natural gas. But in theory, hydrogen can be produced via electrolysis powered by renewable energy. Combine renewable hydrogen with atmospheric nitrogen, and you get fertilizer without fossil fuels. If green ammonia scales, we sever the link between food and gas markets. Saudi Arabia, Australia, Europe, Australia investing in massive projects. Then comes the Holy Grail, gene editing. Scientists are attempting to engineer crops like corn and wheat to fix nitrogen themselves, like legumes do. If major grain crops could eat air, synthetic nitrogen demand would plummet. Sounds like salvation. But salvation has price tags. Green ammonia is currently more expensive than conventional production. Precision agriculture requires capital drones, sensors, software. Gene-edited crops face regulatory, ethical, and commercial hurdles and are likely years away from mass adoption. And here's the structural problem. These technologies are owned, patented, proprietary. If they succeed, they will not be distributed freely. They will be licensed, which raises a disturbing possibility. Food apartheid. High-tech abundance for wealthy nations that can afford green inputs and AI optimization. Volatile scarcity for poorer nations stuck in 20th century fertilizer dependency. Technology will likely save the rich first. It always does. And there is one more economic principle to consider: the Jevons paradox. When we make a resource more efficient, we often don't reduce consumption. We expand it. If fertilizer becomes cheaper and cleaner, we won't necessarily use less. We may expand farmland, increase output, push population growth further. The system doesn't shrink, it grows. So even the optimistic scenario keeps the engine running at full speed. Which means the fertilizer war is not a temporary shock. It is a structural shift. And the final question is not whether we can innovate. It's whether we can transition without chaos, because transitions are messy. And food is the one system where chaos is unforgiving. Let's return to that grocery store. The empty shelves. The manager saying, "We didn't run out of food. We ran out of the chemicals to grow it." That sentence sounds absurd till you understand the plumbing of the global food system. We are not running out of wheat. We are not running out of farmers. We are running into constraints in the invisible inputs that make harvests possible. Nitrogen is energy. Potash is geopolitics. Phosphate is finite. And soil is quietly degrading beneath our feet. For 4 decades, from roughly 1980 to 2020, the world experienced something historically abnormal. Food became cheaper relative to income than at any time in human history. In the United States, households once spent over 30% of income on food. By the early 2000s, it dropped to near 10%. That wasn't normal. It was a product of fossil fuels, globalization, synthetic fertilizer, and fragile supply chains humming in sync. We mistook that anomaly for permanence. But anomalies revert. We are now entering an era of volatility. Energy shocks transmit directly into food prices. Export bans ricochet across continents. Sanctions reshape fertilizer flows. Climate change destabilizes rainfall. Corporate concentration amplifies price swings, and soil health declines in the background. The fertilizer war is not about one conflict. It is about structural dependency, a system where a handful of nations control critical minerals, where a handful of corporations dominate production, where farmers cannot opt out of purchasing inputs, where governments spend billions to prevent bread riots, where calories are currency in geopolitical bargaining. And here is the uncomfortable philosophical truth. A country that cannot feed itself is not sovereign. It is dependent. Food security is national security. If your agriculture relies on imported fertilizer from rivals, if your energy grid dictates your harvest, if your soil erodes faster than it regenerates, you are vulnerable. That vulnerability is now visible. We are witnessing the early stages of a new Cold War, not only over technology, not only over oil, but over nutrients. China restricts exports to protect domestic stability. Russia leverages grain and fertilizer for diplomatic influence. Morocco holds phosphate reserves that will define the century. India bans rice exports to win elections. Indonesia halts palm oil shipments to calm voters. This is not chaos. It is rational behavior in a world where hunger destabilizes governments. The difference between a functioning democracy and a riot can be a few percentage points on food inflation. And so leaders hoard. They subsidize, they weaponize, dictate. Which means the global free market for food is fragmenting, not collapsing overnight, but shifting from just-in-time to just-in-case. Stockpiles, strategic reserves, bilateral fertilizer deals, long-term contracts replacing open markets. And this fragmentation has consequences. For investors, volatility becomes the baseline. For consumers, cheap food becomes a memory. For developing nations, access becomes a negotiation. Does this mean global famine is inevitable? No. Humanity is remarkably inventive. Precision agriculture will spread. Green ammonia will scale. Gene-edited crops will emerge. Regenerative practices will expand. But transitions are rarely smooth. The move from horses to automobiles was chaotic. The shift from coal to oil was geopolitical. The digital revolution created winners and losers. The transformation of agriculture will be no different. There will be countries that adapt quickly, leveraging capital and technology. There will be countries that struggle, trapped between expensive inputs and volatile markets. And there will be corporations that profit during the turbulence. The fertilizer war teaches a simple lesson. The modern food system is the most complex machine ever built. It converts sunlight, fossil fuels, minerals, and trade agreements into calories. It works, so one gear grinds too hard. So the next time you see egg prices spike, or rice exports banned, or headlines about phosphate reserves, understand that you are watching geopolitics in its most primal form. Because beneath ideology, Beneath diplomacy, beneath economic theory, there is biology, and biology does not negotiate. You can debate oil. You can debate currencies. You cannot debate hunger. The 21st century will not be defined only by artificial intelligence or space travel. It will be defined by who controls the inputs of life itself: energy, minerals, soil, and ultimately, food. The era of cheap abundance is fading. What replaces it depends on whether we treat fertilizer as just another commodity or recognize it as the foundation of civilization. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and most importantly, stay fed.